In 2021, news broke that children's bodies had been found in mass graves at the sites of former Indian residential schools across Canada. What followed was weeks of protest, months of mourning, and a string of violent assaults on Canadian history. And then 100 churches in Canada were attacked, vandalized, or burned to the ground following those claims. But today, no bodies have actually been found in these supposed mass graves. In fact, the language has changed from mass graves to anomalies in the ground. But that has not stopped federal officials and activists from calling on the federal government to criminalize so-called residential school denialism, to make it a crime to state the truth, that being that no bodies have actually been found in mass graves at residential schools. And also to state that, in fact, there were some good things that came from the residential school system. These federal officials and activists want to make these statements a crime, criminalizing the truth and promoting a lie. Now, if that just isn't symbolic of the direction this country is headed in. Well, our next guest on the Faulkner Show knows quite a bit about residential schools. In fact, he lived in and worked for a residential school in the 60s. To these activists, he is a denier. Well, joining us now on the Faulkner Show is Rodney Clifton, Professor Emeritus at the University of Manitoba, author and Senior Fellow at the Frontier Centre. And between 1967 and 1966, Rodney Clifton lived in and worked for an Indian residential school. Professor Clifton, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
In an article published in C2C Journal, you take aim at the recent efforts to criminalize so-called residential school denialism. The title of your essay on the C2C Journal is, "They Would Call Me a Denier. Let me explain what I believe about residential schools in Canada." So to summarize for us, Professor, what do you believe about residential schools, and why does that make you a denier in the eyes of some?
That's a very interesting question. First of all, I believe that there were good and bad things that happened in residential school, and that the good has been outshadowed by the claims of bad, and people were getting increase in money for saying bad things, and so we're getting a lot of people saying that they were victims of all kinds of abuse in the schools. Now, there's some abuse went on, obviously, and I think some people have been charged with that abuse, but not every child and not every school was full of people who abused abused the children. I'm surprised that the churches haven't stood up and defended their innocent missionaries that they send out to work on in these places, and I'm trying to correct that, both for Aboriginal people as well as for other Canadians that are paying a tremendous amount of money for the compensation for supposedly murdering children in residential schools. I don't think there's any children that have been murdered and buried in schoolyards, and the reason for that, there are many reasons for that, but one of the main reasons for that is that Indian Affairs, in all its variations, ask for quarterly reports every year, and they listed the names of the children and how the children were doing in the residence as well as in the school, and they got paid on the basis of the number of children. So why would they murder children to get rid of them if in fact they're getting a payment for each of the child that's being there? And if a child has to go to a hospital or go to a sanatorium or something like that, then the payment was decreased on these records. That's only one of the reasons, but there's many other reasons as well. Many people were coming and going out of the schools, including parents, including medical doctors, including optometrists, including dentists that come in and help fix children's teeth, and they would have obviously reported that children were being mistreated if they saw that that kind of evidence. So we haven't got any records of this. Now, I'm not saying that no children were abused or murdered in the school. I'm just saying that the records don't support the claim.
And, you know, this push to criminalize what is being described as residential school denialism seems extremely dangerous at least in my eyes, and I think to many Canadians, especially given what we have seen recently over the past few years and the claims that have since been debunked about the residential school system. But in more detail, what exactly constitutes residential school denialism? Is it simply denying that residential schools existed? Or is it, for example, saying that, as you just said, there are some good things that happened at these schools?
I think it's both of those things, and they're lumping them together, the other side, and saying that if you say that there's some good things that went on in these schools, that you're in fact denying that the schools actually existed, which is an extension that is unwarranted.
You've worked in these residential schools, so I think you, unlike most people who talk about this issue today, actually have an experience that is required to really address this. What are some of the good things that did happen in these schools? Because that side, of course, never really gets told in the media.
Yeah. My wife went to residential school, Old Sun on the Blackfoot Reserve, where she grew up for 10 years. And when we were young, she used to call, people would ask her if she went to residential school, and she said, no, she went to a private Anglican school. And so many of the teachers that she had were lifelong friends of hers and thought of her and all the other young people that were in the schools as being their children, in the same sort of way that teachers in other schools thought about the children that they were teaching, that they were part of their extended family, and they were treated as such. And I've heard many stories from both my wife as well as from her parents about the positive things that went on in these schools, and the jokes that were being played between the supervisors and the students. And the same thing happened when I worked in Stringer Hall, which is in Inuvik, at the Anglican residence there for a year. I looked after 85 kids, 22 hours a day, 6 days a week. Now, during some of that time, the kids were in school, of course, but if they were sick, they would often be in the residence, unless they were so sick that they were in the infirmary or sent to the hospital. So I got to know kids very well. I was 21 years of age. I was interested in these children, and we had very positive relationships. Now, of course, we tried to get them to speak English, but in Inuvik, there were two young women that helped supervise the junior boys and the junior girls, and they spoke Inuktitut to those children all the time. When the children were coming down the hall and speaking Inuktitut, the little kids, I would wave my finger at them, and they would put their hands over their mouth and turn around and go the other way, speaking Inuktitut, and then look back. It was kind of a cat and mouse game in which we wanted them to speak English, but if they had to speak to somebody, they would speak Inuktitut, and they would be able to communicate with each other. Pretty soon they learned English and could speak in English, but at the very beginning, when the 6-year-olds come in, they only spoke Inuktitut, the kids from the high Arctic. The Indian kids from along the river, Mackenzie River, spoke English when they came in, but the Inuit children didn't.
Well, it seems that if these calls to criminalize residential school denialism are realized, what you have just said, and maybe this show itself, would be criminal, as it is engaging in an act of residential school denialism. How real of a possibility is this? Is this really something that could happen in Canada, that just saying what you've just said could be a crime?
I didn't think so until I've seen what happened with the truckers' convoy, and what happened in Canada with the COVID pandemic, and the way that medical doctors were treated, the way that common citizens were treated. I'm starting to believe that, yes, it is possible that people who deny something, even if it happens to be a lie, as we found out with the COVID, um, could be criminalized.
So even just saying, for example, that there have been no human remains excavated out of the from the grounds of former residential school sites, like were claimed in 2021, even just saying that would be a crime under the push to make denialism a criminal?
Yes, it seems that's the truth. We haven't seen any remains. We've given the Kamloops band $7.9 million to excavate, and we haven't seen any evidence of that. We haven't even got the report of the anthropologist that did the ground penetrating radar on that. And I've seen results of ground penetrating radar. It's not like looking at an X-ray of a person where you can determine bones and things like that. All you see is squiggly lines. So you don't see graves, and they're claiming that these are graves. Now they switch back and forth. Sometimes she said they are graves, and other times she said that they're just anomalies. And she's back to saying that they're graves again. So until we actually see the evidence, they're trying to stop any kind of debate going on this issue. The Aboriginal people are not the only ones, but the journalists are, as you know, and academics are doing the same sort of thing, trying to shut down any sort of discussion of this issue.
So we're entering a territory in which saying the truth could be a crime, and pushing a falsehood would be protected. What does this mean for the history and academia and studying history, if there are strict guidelines on what can be said and what can't be said, especially when the truth can't even be said? You're a professor. What does this mean for the study of history?
It means that there's be certain political overtones in history that have to be abided by, and people can't engage in contrary arguments in which they question that. So if politicians and reporters don't tell us the truth, how are Canadians supposed to make valid decisions in elections and uh, understanding of what should be taught in schools and in universities and in colleges and that sort of thing, if we've got a stranglehold on the positions that can be offered? It's very similar to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer experienced in Germany when it was proclaimed that people of Jewish extraction were enemies of the state, right, and should be eliminated. Of course, nobody's saying that people should be eliminated now, but they're talking about putting people in jail.
Right. And what does this mean for Indigenous Canadians? I can't imagine that pushing something like this with the specific parameters around residential school denialism, not just denialism, but specifically denialism on this subject. I can't imagine that this is positive for Indigenous Canadians. What do you make of this?
Oh, absolutely not. I think they need to have experienced the truth as well as everybody else. And I think there's quite a few people probably that are living on the reserves who have questions in their own minds, and they know what went on in the schools, but they're afraid to speak up because they will be treated even worse than people that are living off the reserves are treated. So I think we're trying to help all of Canada rather than just the non-Indigenous population. And I
So
think in
this
the
is,
whole thing,
yeah,
whoops, sorry.
go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that if this doesn't help Indigenous Canadians, then why do you think this is being pushed in the first place?
I That's a very good question. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that because there's a lot of money tied up in this, and making these kinds of claims can result in a lot of money flowing from non-Aboriginal Canadians through the government to reserves. So the federal government has set aside $320 million for excavations, and increasingly more people, more brands are applying for this kind of money, and they make the claim that they're sure that there are bodies of children in the ground. But so far, we haven't had any excavations that have discovered anything. We've all the excavations that have been done at Camsell Hospital, at Pine Creek, have discovered that there were rocks and tree roots and other things that were buried in the ground that they had seen through the uh, through the ground penetrating radar.
You would think that not being able to discover human remains at the grounds of former residential schools would be a good result, would be a good thing for Canadians to say, well, thankfully, we haven't discovered a mass grave. But do you feel like that for some, do you feel that for some of these activists who have been pushing this narrative, that actually not finding any graves at all was a defeat to them, and that they're disappointed in not being able to find hundreds of dead bodies?
I think that's absolutely true. And if you listen to some of the interviews that some of the chiefs have had after the ground penetrating radar and the excavations were uh, conducted, their tone of their voice seems that they were disappointed that they never found. And I was elated because
Right.
I don't think there's children buried, and I don't think that Canadians should believe in something that may strongly not be true.
Do you think that some of this, and some of the things that we saw during 2021, I'm thinking in particular of the federal government's decision to lower Canadian flags across the world for 6 months, and to topple down our statues, to attack historical figures who frankly had nothing to do with the residential school system. Do you think that a lot of this has to do with a deep-seated hatred for Canada itself?
It certainly seems that to me, and I think that we can't manage a country if we've got a substantial number of people who actually do not appreciate the good things that have happened in Canada, even the good things that have happened to Aboriginal people who use cell phones and use internet and use all kinds of modern technology in the same sort of way that the rest of us. When the government gets tied into these kinds of conspiracies, then I think there's a real problem with our country. And I wish the Conservatives, the People's Party, and the other parties would stand up and would not have voted that residential schools was a genocide, as yeah, was said in Parliament a few months ago.
And why do you think it is that we have political leaders who are not actually willing to fight this topic, stand and fight for the truth? It's not about one side or the other. It's not about picking one ethnic group of Canadians to support. It's about the truth versus versus falsehoods. Why do you think it is that we don't have a loud conservative opposition standing up and defending the truth on this issue?
That is a very good question. And it seems to me that when politicians do not fight for the truth, that we're in the process of losing our country. We're losing our freedom. We're losing our freedom of speech. We're losing the sense of what true journalism is, as you're engaging in now. And it simply becomes a clash of ideologies. I believe this and you believe that, and these things clash, and I'm right and you're wrong. And no matter, and there's no evidence is required. How can you run a university on the basis of, saying that the earth is flat or all kinds of things without people actually saying, okay, demonstrate to me why that claim is true. Here, all we're asking is for demonstration of the truth of that claim. Now, on the positive side, I think increasingly we've got a group of about 20 people that are working on this issue. And increasingly, it seems to me that more people are actually scratching their head and beginning to ask questions. The sales of the book Grave Error that Tom Flanagan and Chris Champion, through the support of True North, published, is evidence, I think, that increasingly Canadians are becoming concerned about this issue and want to know what the other side of the argument is. I think that's a good thing, but I wish we could persuade some of the politicians to at least scratch their head and to get off the bandwagon that is going in probably the wrong direction. We're not exactly sure that it's the wrong direction, but we need to debate it in order to figure out what is in fact true.
There are issues facing every type of group in this country, just as there are issues facing Indigenous Canadians. I don't believe that residential school denialism is one of those issues. What would be a better source of time and effort from the government in order to try to address Indigenous issues than pursuing criminalizing speech regarding residential schools? What are some of the issues that are facing Indigenous Canadians that the government should prioritize?
Well, I think doing a really good assessment of the economic prospects and the behavior of Aboriginal people, and helping them uh, get out of, in many cases, really desperate situations on really very small reserves with very few jobs and very little opportunities, and getting children. Increasingly, more children are going to school, but getting children through into school and through school without using affirmative action that stigmatizes, that can stigmatize those children. I think that would be a much more profitable way, and I wish the chiefs and newspaper reporters and the government would certainly turn their attention to that kind of an issue. When you go downtown in Winnipeg and you see, Aboriginal people on the street corner and children that are not going to school, or not, doing the things that they should be doing, but taking drugs and things like that, it's very depressing, and
Absolutely.
that should be fixed, rather than going after people who question residential school. But there's a whole industry now with all kind $320 million tied up that can be accessed by making these kinds of claims, and saying that there are children buried outside of various residential school properties in our country.
And to think about that, to think that there's $300 million of taxpayer money going to this, when it could be going to people who genuinely need the help and the assistance on an actual day-to-day basis, is actually quite disgusting. Professor, I know you are working on a book right now about residential schools. Can you tell our audience a little more about that, and where they can pre-order that book?
Yeah, the book is called "From Truth Comes Reconciliation: An Assessment," and the first edition was published by Frontier Second, and the second edition is going to be published by Summer. Oh my gosh, Summerland House Press, and it can be ordered through contacting the Frontier Center for Public Policy in Winnipeg, fcpp.org, so people can get it there. And also, Grave Errors, the one that True North was involved in with
Right.
Dorchester Review. True North is that book has been unbelievably positive. So what we do in our book is we summarize at the very beginning the history coming up to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then we do a nice summary of what the results were, and then we got section on criticisms of the report, and then we got personal reflections, in which my reflection and some other people's reflections of working in these schools are reported. And then we've got a conclusion on what we suggest should be done in the future, instead of digging this pit and hoping more people fall into it.
Absolutely. Well, Professor, that is all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed that interview and want to read more about this subject, you can find Professor Clifton's essay in C2C Journal. A link to the article you can also find in the description of this video. Professor Clifton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.